he only married once. That's the first thing to remember. But in the universe of Elvis Presley, marriage was the final frontier, an island he visited just a single time with Priscilla. Yet, the waters around that island were crowded with other ships, women who claimed they were on the final voyage with him, holding a ticket marked to Fiancée. He died on August 16th, 1977. He was found by his fiancée, Ginger Alden. Or was she? He had lived for over 4 years with Linda Thompson, a woman he often called his wife, and to whom he proposed. So why wasn't she there? Before them all, there was Anita Wood, the one he supposedly proposed to before the army shipped him to Germany, a life that was erased by the arrival of a teenager named Priscilla Beaulieu. You know, these women were more than just girlfriends. They held rings. They heard promises. They lived inside the gilded cage of Graceland. And when Elvis died, their stories became part of his legend, a confusing and often contradictory epilogue. The world saw a man who had everything, but these women saw a man desperate for something he could never quite hold on to. A normal life, a lasting love. So who was telling the truth? Were these genuine engagements, or were they just grand, empty gestures from a man who used diamonds the way other people use words? Were these women true partners, or were they the last in a long line of beautiful placeholders, temporary fixes for a loneliness that was as vast as his fame? The questions linger, decades later, still echoing in the silent rooms of Graceland. Number 15 was Ginger Alden's engagement, a publicity stunt or a desperate last act. Ginger Alden was the last one. She holds a unique and tragic place in the Elvis story. She was the one who found him unresponsive on the floor of his bathroom at Graceland on August 16th, 1977. She was just 20 years old. Elvis was 42. They had known each other for less than a year, and in her hand, or at least in her story, was a massive diamond ring, a token of a proposal she claimed happened just months before his death. Her version of events is laid out in her 2014 book, Elvis and Ginger. She describes a whirlwind romance with a man who is both a global icon and a deeply troubled soul. According to her, Elvis proposed on January 26, 1977 in his bathroom at Graceland. He sat her down on his throne and presented her with a huge diamond ring, its center stone taken from a TCB ring he designed himself. It was a staggering 11.5 carats. He had a wedding date set, she said, for Christmas of 1977. It was a story of a man finding love and a new reason to live in his final days. But from the very beginning, there were doubts. Many inside Elvis's inner circle, the Memphis Mafia, questioned the legitimacy of the engagement. Some saw Ginger and her family, particularly her mother Jo, as social climbers. In the explosive 1977 book Elvis What Happened, written by former bodyguards Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, the authors portray a man surrounded by people who enabled his worst impulses. While the book was published just before his death and doesn't focus heavily on Ginger, the atmosphere it describes is one where Elvis's judgment was severely impaired. Was he in any condition to make a life-altering commitment? Members of his own family seemed unsure. His father, Vernon Presley, barely mentioned Ginger in his own book, Elvis: A Tribute to My Son. He acknowledged her presence but gave no weight to the idea of an impending marriage. Others, like Elvis's cousin Billy Smith, who was one of the last people to see Elvis alive, have given conflicting accounts over the years, some supportive of the engagement, others suggesting it was not as solid as Ginger portrayed. They saw a man who was deeply lonely and prone to grand gestures. Giving a woman a ring was not necessarily the same as planning a future. The controversy deepened after Elvis's death. The Alden family sued the Elvis estate for $100,000, claiming Elvis had promised to pay off the mortgage on their home. The estate fought back. During the legal proceedings, it was revealed that Ginger's mother had secretly recorded conversations with Elvis. The court ultimately sided with the estate, ruling that a verbal promise was not legally binding. The lawsuit left a bitter taste and fueled speculation that the Aldens were more interested in Elvis's money than his love. It painted the picture of a family trying to secure their financial future through a relationship with a vulnerable superstar. Then there was the ring itself. While it was undoubtedly a massive and expensive piece of jewelry, its status as an engagement ring is debatable. And Elvis was famous for his extravagant generosity. He gave away cars, houses, and jewelry on a whim. Linda Thompson, his previous long-term girlfriend, had a collection of incredible jewelry from him, including rings that could have easily been mistaken for engagement rings. Was this ring to Ginger a true promise of marriage, or was it just another spectacular gift from a man who showed affection through material things? The fact that the proposal supposedly happened in a bathroom, a place that became his final resting place, adds a layer of grim surrealism to the story. The timeline is also incredibly compressed. They met in late 1976. He proposed in January 1977. He was dead by August 1977. During this period, Elvis was in a state of severe physical and mental decline, heavily dependent on a cocktail of prescription drugs documented extensively in Peter Guralnick's definitive biography, Careless Love, The Unmaking of Elvis Presley. Guralnick paints a portrait of a man in his final months, who was isolated, paranoid, and barely functional. Was this a man planning a wedding, or a man just trying to get through the day? Ginger's account of a happy, future-focused Elvis seems at odds with almost every other account from that period. So we are left with a difficult legacy. Was Ginger Alden the tragic final love of his life, the woman who was robbed of her future just as it was beginning? Or was she a young, perhaps naive woman caught up in a powerful family's ambition, whose relationship was posthumously elevated to an engagement to secure a place in history and potentially a piece of the estate? The questions that remain are unsettling. Did Ginger's mother and sisters orchestrate the relationship, seeing a golden opportunity in the lonely king? Was the proposal a genuine moment of clarity and hope for Elvis? Or was it a drug-fueled, impulsive act he might not have even remembered the next day? And if Elvis had lived, would he have ever made it to that Christmas wedding? Or would Ginger Alden have simply become another beautiful woman with a story about the time Elvis Presley gave her a ring? Number 14. If Linda Thompson was the one who got away, why did she leave? For 4.5 years, from 1972 to late 1976, Linda Thompson was the center of Elvis Presley's universe. She wasn't a brief flame or a passing fancy. She lived with him at Graceland. She toured with him. She nursed him through his darkest and most frightening health crises. She was, by all accounts, a stabilizing force in a life spinning out of control. And Elvis himself often introduced her as his wife. And she writes in her memoir, A Little Thing Called Life, that he proposed to her multiple times. So, why did she walk away less than a year before he died? Her story provides one of the most intimate and heartbreaking views into the private world of the late-stage Elvis. When she met him in 1972, he was fresh from his separation from Priscilla. Linda was a 22-year-old beauty queen, Miss Tennessee Universe. She was wholesome, grounded, and deeply devoted. For a time, it seemed like a perfect match. He needed stability, and she was willing to provide it. She redecorated Graceland, tried to get him to eat healthier, and attempted to wean him off his dangerous dependency on prescription drugs. The accounts from this period, both from her book and from Memphis Mafia members like Joe Esposito, paint a picture of a domestic life that was as close to normal as Elvis could get. They would rent out movie theaters and amusement parks, ride horses, and spend nights talking. Linda understood his spiritual searching, his love for gospel music, and his complicated relationship with his own fame. He gave her a lavish lifestyle, showering her with jewelry, cars, and homes. But it all came at a very high price. The core reason she left was simple: she wanted a normal life, and he was incapable of giving her one. This desire wasn't a secret. She loved him, but she also saw that the life he was living was a dead end. The primary issue was his escalating drug use. In her memoir, Thompson details harrowing episodes where she would find him unconscious or having a severe reaction to the pills supplied by Dr. George Nicopolis, a man whose medical practices would later come under intense scrutiny. She would have to stay up all night, making sure he was still breathing, forcing him to drink water to flush his system. It was less a romance and more a constant state of caretaking. She was his lover, but she was also his nurse. Then there was the infidelity. Elvis preached loyalty and demanded it from her, but he did not practice it himself. While Linda was at home in Graceland, he was on the road with other women. It was a pattern established long before her, one that Priscilla Presley also endured. Elvis had a deeply ingrained double standard, a product of his time and his Southern upbringing, which he used his fame to justify. Linda was the good girl at home, but he still sought fleeting excitement on tour. She tolerated it for years, but the emotional toll was immense. She felt her own identity disappearing. As she told People magazine in a 2016 interview, I was a realist. I knew my life with him was not a normal life. The final straw came in late 1976. She realized that she couldn't save him. Her love and devotion were not enough to overcome his addictions and his deep-seated psychological issues. He was surrounded by enablers, and she was the lone voice of dissent, a voice he was starting to tune out. She had to choose between staying and watching him die, or leaving to save herself. She chose to save herself. Her departure was not a dramatic, door-slamming affair. It was a quiet, painful conversation. She told him she loved him, but she couldn't live that life anymore. She wanted children, a husband who was present, a life free from the constant shadow of drugs and other women. According to her account, he understood, even if it broke his heart. It was a moment of sad clarity for both of them. He let her go. Just a few weeks later, he met Ginger Alden. Linda Thompson's story is crucial because it shatters the myth of the perfect life with the king. She had it all, the mansion, the private jet, the diamonds, and she walked away from it because it was fundamentally hollow. Her credibility is rarely questioned. Even the most cynical members of Elvis's inner circle acknowledged her genuine love and care for him. She remained on good terms with his daughter, Lisa Marie, for years. Her narrative has been remarkably consistent for over 40 years. She doesn't present herself as a victim, but as a woman who made a difficult choice. Her departure leaves us with some of the most poignant what-ifs in the Elvis saga. What if he had listened to her? What if he had been able to get clean and offer her the normal life she craved? Could she have saved him if she had stayed? Or was his path of self-destruction already set, and she was just the last person to try and pull him from the wreckage? Her decision to leave highlights a tragic truth sometimes: love isn't enough. The questions that linger about her time with Elvis are profound. Was she the only person who truly understood the depth of his addiction and despair in those final years? Did Elvis propose to her so many times because he genuinely wanted to marry her, or because he was terrified of her leaving and used the promise of marriage as a way to keep her? And ultimately, does her story prove that no woman, no matter how loving or devoted, could have ever truly saved Elvis from himself? Number 13, did Elvis use engagement rings as control tactics? Elvis Presley gave away a lot of rings, big, flashy, expensive rings, to girlfriends, to friends, to members of his entourage, even to complete strangers. In his world, a gift of jewelry was a sign of favor, a token of affection, a mark of being in the inner circle. But when it came to the women he was romantically involved with, the giving of a ring often carried a heavier, more complicated weight. It often looked like a proposal. But was it? Or was Elvis using the promise of marriage, symbolized by a diamond ring, as a powerful tool of control? Looking at the pattern of his relationships, a disturbing picture emerges. The act of giving a ring often coincided with a moment when he needed to secure a woman's loyalty or pull her back from the brink of leaving. It was a grand gesture designed to overwhelm, to create a sense of obligation, and to reinforce his traditional patriarchal view of relationships. He wanted his woman at home, waiting for him, pure and untouched by the outside world. An engagement was the ultimate way to formalize that arrangement. Consider the case of Anita Wood. He dated her seriously from 1957 until he left for the army in 1958. By many accounts, including her own in interviews for the 2011 book Elvis, The Best of British, he asked her to marry him before he shipped out. He gave her a ring. She waited for him. She was the perfect loyal girl back home. But while in Germany, he met the 14-year-old Priscilla Beaulieu. When Elvis returned to the States, he tried to juggle both women for a time. The engagement to Anita was the anchor that kept her waiting while he explored a new relationship. Eventually, Anita found out about Priscilla and confronted him. The relationship ended, and the promise was broken. The ring served its purpose. It kept her on the hook until he was ready to move on. And then there was Priscilla. Theirs was a long, strange courtship managed from afar while she was a teenager in Germany, and he was a movie star in Hollywood. The promise of marriage was the entire basis of their relationship. It was the justification for her moving to Graceland as a high school student, a move that was highly controversial and carefully managed by Elvis and Colonel Tom Parker. The engagement was a way to legitimize an unconventional situation. It placed Priscilla in a gilded cage, living under his rules, waiting for him to be ready for marriage. He controlled her clothes, her hair, her entire life, all under the pretext that she was his future wife. After Priscilla, the pattern continued with Linda Thompson. As she describes in her book, he proposed multiple times. These proposals often came during turbulent periods, perhaps after a fight, or when his drug use was particularly bad. It was a way of saying, stay with me, I'm serious about you, this is real. A diamond ring was a tangible, glittering distraction from the chaos of their daily lives. It was a down payment on a future he may have had no real intention of building. It reinforced her role as the future Mrs. Presley, the woman who would stand by him no matter what. And finally, Ginger Alden. He met her when his relationship with Linda Thompson was over and his health was in a catastrophic state. He was lonely, isolated, and visibly deteriorating. Proposing to Ginger so quickly within months of meeting her can be seen as a desperate act to secure a constant companion. He needed someone there in Graceland at all times, and engagement solidified that. It gave him a sense of control over his immediate environment at a time when he was losing control over everything else. But, his career, his health, his own mind, psychologists might look at this behavior as a form of narcissistic love bombing. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology on relationship dynamics highlights how grand gestures and promises of a shared future can be used to create intense emotional bonds and a sense of dependency, particularly in relationships with a significant power imbalance. Elvis was the king of his world. The women he chose were typically much younger and less experienced. A proposal from Elvis Presley wasn't just a question, it was a life-altering event that could be nearly impossible to refuse. It was a way to mark his territory. The rings were not just jewelry, they were symbols of ownership. They told the world, and more importantly, they told the woman that she belonged to him. It was a tactic that worked for a time with almost every significant woman in his life. But it was a short-term solution to a long-term problem of loneliness and an inability to form a truly equal partnership. So, were these real engagements? The question itself might be flawed. For Elvis, a ring may have been a sincere expression of love in that moment. But it was also a tool. It was a way to stop a woman from leaving, to quiet her doubts, to make her wait, to make her his. The real lingering questions are about intent. Did he ever believe he would follow through on these promises, or was he knowingly creating a fantasy to keep these women by his side? How many other women whose stories we've never heard were also given rings and promises in a moment of passion or desperation? And does this pattern suggest that for Elvis, the idea of a fiancé was more about possession than partnership? Number 12. How did Priscilla's shadow loom over every other woman? Priscilla Presley was the only woman who ever legally held the title of Mrs. Elvis Presley. Their marriage lasted from 1967 to 1973. She was the mother of his only child, Lisa Marie. And because of this, she cast a long and inescapable shadow over every woman who came after her. For Linda Thompson and Ginger Alden, Priscilla was not just an ex-wife, she was a benchmark, a ghost, and a permanent part of the family they were trying to join. And Elvis put her on a pedestal from the very beginning. He met her in Germany when she was just 14. As detailed in both her 1985 autobiography, Elvis and Me, and Peter Grolnick's biographies, Elvis saw in her the chance to mold his perfect woman. She was young, innocent, and unspoiled. He could shape her into his ideal. He chose her clothes, dictated her makeup, and had her dye her hair black to match his. She was his living doll. This act of creation tied her to him in a way that was fundamentally different from his other relationships. When they divorced in 1973, it was a profound blow to Elvis's ego and his romantic ideal. He had lost the woman he had spent over a decade cultivating. Though the divorce was amicable, they famously held hands walking out of the courthouse. It left a permanent scar. According to many members of the Memphis Mafia, including his close friend Marty Lacker, Elvis never truly got over Priscilla. He loved her, but he also loved the idea of her, the perfect wife and mother he had created, who ultimately chose to leave him to find her own identity. This unhealed wound directly impacted his subsequent relationships. Linda Thompson moved into Graceland shortly after Priscilla moved out. She was, in many ways, the anti-Priscilla. She was blonde, vivacious, and more of a peer than a protege. Yet, the ghost of Priscilla was everywhere. Elvis would frequently talk about her, sometimes fondly, sometimes angrily. Linda had to live in the house that Priscilla had decorated, surrounded by photos of her predecessor. It was an impossible situation. In her book, A Little Thing Called Life, Linda Thompson describes how Elvis would sometimes compare her to Priscilla, either favorably or unfavorably, depending on his mood. The marriage had set a standard. Priscilla had given him a child, a milestone Linda was never able to reach with him. Elvis talked about having more children, but his deteriorating health and lifestyle made that a fantasy. Priscilla was the mother of the heir to the throne, a role that gave her a permanent and unimpeachable status within the Presley dynasty, a status no girlfriend or fiancé could ever hope to achieve. The dynamic with Ginger Alden was different, but the shadow was still there. By the time Ginger entered the picture in late 1976, Elvis was more disconnected from his past. Yet, the structure of his life was still built around the family he had with Priscilla. Lisa Marie was a frequent visitor to Graceland, a constant and beloved reminder of the life he once had. Any woman who was with Elvis had to accept that Priscilla and Lisa Marie were a package deal. They were his family. Everyone else was, to some extent, a guest. Priscilla's influence wasn't just emotional, it was practical. After Elvis's death, she became the co-executor of his estate. It was her business acumen, alongside a team of advisors, that saved Graceland from bankruptcy and turned it into the global tourist destination it is today. It's of the immense power to shape the official narrative of Elvis's life. In the story told by the estate, Priscilla is the great love, the wife, the mother. Other women, even long-term partners like Linda Thompson, are often relegated to the status of girlfriend. The title of Fiancée, especially for Ginger Alden, has been consistently downplayed by the official Elvis Presley enterprises. This control over the legacy is a crucial part of Priscilla's enduring power. She has been able to frame her own story and, by extension, the stories of her rivals. Her book was a bestseller. It became the definitive insider account for a generation. Linda and Ginger released their memoirs decades later, writing in response to a narrative that was already firmly established, a narrative in which they were supporting characters. The presence of Priscilla forces us to reevaluate the claims of the other women. Was Elvis trying to replace her, or was he trying to find something completely different? It seems he was doing both. He wanted the devotion and domesticity he associated with his early years with Priscilla, but he was unwilling or unable to offer the faithfulness and stability required to sustain it. He was chasing a feeling he had lost, trying to recreate a home that had been broken. So the questions surrounding Priscilla's influence are complex. Did Elvis's unresolved feelings for Priscilla make it impossible for him to ever fully commit to another woman? Were Linda and Ginger doomed from the start, tasked with competing against a romanticized and idealized memory? And how much has Priscilla's role as the protector of the Elvis legacy shaped our modern understanding of these other women, perhaps unfairly diminishing their importance in his life? Number 11. What really happened between Elvis and Anne Margaret? Of all the women in Elvis Presley's life, Anne Margaret holds a unique position. She was not a fiancée. She was not a live-in girlfriend. She was his co-star in the 1964 film Viva Las Vegas, and for a brief, intense period, she was arguably his female equivalent, a dynamic, electrifying performer who could match him energy for energy on screen. Their chemistry was so powerful, so undeniable that it leaped off the screen and into a passionate, year-long affair. Many fans and insiders believe she was his true soulmate. So why didn't it last? The story of their relationship is a classic Hollywood romance, but with an Elvis twist. When they met on the set, he was already unofficially committed to Priscilla, who was waiting for him back at Graceland. Anne Margaret was a rising star in her own right, a female Elvis, as the press dubbed her. Unlike the other women in his life, she was not someone he could easily control. She had her own career, her own ambitions, her own powerful personality. In her 1994 autobiography, Anne Margaret, My Story, she described their connection as instant and profound. "We were indeed soulmates," she wrote. "Quietly, gently, we told each other that we loved each other." They shared a love for motorcycles, music, and a similar, slightly wicked sense of humor. Photos and outtakes from the Viva Las Vegas set show a level of genuine intimacy and playful joy that is absent from most of his other movie appearances. Members of the Memphis Mafia, like Joe Esposito, have confirmed that the affair was intense and that Elvis was completely captivated by her. For a moment, it seemed like he had found his perfect match, an equal partner who understood the pressures of fame. But the relationship was doomed by two major obstacles, Priscilla and Colonel Tom Parker. Elvis was already entangled in his long-standing promise to marry Priscilla. It was a commitment he had made years earlier, and one he felt honor-bound to keep, despite his feelings for Anne Margaret. He was caught between a woman who represented a passionate, exciting future and a woman who represented duty, stability, and a promise he had made. Colonel Parker, Elvis's notoriously controlling manager, was the other major hurdle. The colonel saw the affair as a threat. First, it created a potential publicity nightmare. The press caught wind of the romance, running headlines about a supposed engagement between Elvis and Anne Margaret. This infuriated both Elvis and the colonel. In his book, The Colonel, The Extraordinary Story of Colonel Tom Parker and Elvis Presley, author Alana Nash details how Parker worked to quash the rumors and manage the fallout. He saw any serious relationship for Elvis, particularly with another celebrity, as a distraction and a threat to his control. He didn't want a powerful woman like Anne Margaret influencing his star client. The end came abruptly. According to Anne Margaret's book, she was confronted by the press about the engagement rumors and gave a non-committal answer. Elvis, seeing the headlines, felt betrayed. He felt she had used their relationship for publicity. He ended the affair. It was a painful and, by her account, heartbreaking conclusion. He went back to his life with Priscilla, and within a few years, he married her. Anne Margaret went on to marry the actor Roger Smith, a marriage that lasted 50 years until his death. But the connection didn't completely die. They remained friends, a rare occurrence for Elvis and his ex-lovers. Anne Margaret wrote that for the rest of his life, whenever she was performing in Las Vegas, a bouquet of flowers and a guitar-shaped vase would arrive in her dressing room from him. You know, the card always read, "From EP." It was a quiet acknowledgement of what they had shared. After he died, she was one of the few celebrities to attend his funeral, a silent, veiled figure mourning the man she once loved. The relationship with Anne Margaret represents a critical what-if in the Elvis story. What if he had been free from his commitment to Priscilla? What if the colonel hadn't interfered? Would a marriage between two such dynamic, high-powered stars have even been sustainable? Or would their twin flames have burned too bright and burned out? Some cultural historians, like Elaine Dundee in her book Elvis and Gladys, suggest that Elvis was psychologically incapable of being with a true equal. He was conditioned by his Southern upbringing and his relationship with his mother to be the dominant figure in any romance. A strong, independent woman like Anne Margaret ultimately challenged that dynamic. The story of Elvis and Anne Margaret forces us to question the very nature of his romantic choices. Was his decision to marry Priscilla over Anne Margaret a choice for love or a choice for control? Did he sabotage his one chance at a relationship with an equal because, deep down, he was afraid of it? And if they had ended up together, how might the story of Elvis Presley and his tragic final years have been different? Number 10 was Anita Wood, the first true fiancée he betrayed. Before Priscilla, before the Hollywood years, before the jumpsuits and the Las Vegas residencies, there was Anita Wood. In the whirlwind year of 1957, as Elvis Presley became the most famous man on the planet, Anita Wood was the woman by his side. She was a beautiful, popular Memphis television personality and singer. For nearly a year before he was drafted into the Army, she was his constant companion, the one he brought home to Graceland to meet his beloved mother Gladys. And according to Anita, he gave her a ring and asked her to marry him. She was arguably the first real fiancée, and her story is a cautionary tale of love, trust, and betrayal. Their relationship was intense and, for its time, very public. Newspapers and magazines were filled with photos of them together at amusement parks, on his motorcycle at Graceland. She was with him during some of the most pivotal moments of his early career. Most importantly, she was approved by Gladys. Elvis's mother was the most important person in his world, and her opinion of any girlfriend was paramount. Gladys adored Anita, seeing her as a wholesome, down-to-earth Southern girl who could be a good wife for her son. This maternal seal of approval gave the relationship a legitimacy that none of his previous flings had. In the 2005 documentary Elvis by the Presleys, Anita recalled their time together with fondness, describing a surprisingly normal courtship amidst the chaos of his fame. She stated that before he left for Germany in 1958, he asked her to wait for him. The promise of marriage hung in the air. He gave her what has been described as a friendship, or promise ring, a symbol of his commitment. He wrote her letters from Germany, and she wrote back, holding on to the belief that she would be Mrs. Elvis Presley when he returned. But Germany changed everything. First, in August 1958, Gladys died. The loss devastated Elvis and severed a key link to his life back in Memphis, a life in which Anita was a central figure. Then, in late 1959, he met 14-year-old Priscilla Beaulieu. He was immediately infatuated with her youth and innocence. He began a secret courtship with Priscilla while still writing letters to Anita, effectively leading a double life. The betrayal came to a head when Elvis returned to the U.S. in 1960. He tried to juggle both relationships, a feat made possible by his immense fame and the complicity of his entourage. But secrets in Elvis's world rarely stayed secret for long. As told in Peter Guralnick's Last Train to Memphis, Anita eventually became suspicious. The final confrontation happened in 1962. She found a letter from Priscilla and realized the extent of his deception. In a tense phone call, she made him choose. He tried to evade, to smooth things over, but she held her ground. When he wouldn't give her a straight answer, she knew it was over. She walked away, heartbroken. Anita Wood's story is crucial because it establishes a pattern that would repeat throughout Elvis's life, the promise of commitment to one woman while secretly pursuing another. It demonstrates his deep-seated conflict between the good girl at home, Anita, and the new, exciting ingenue, Priscilla. His betrayal of Anita was not just a personal failure, it was a turning point. It marked the moment when the relatively innocent rock and roll idol from Memphis began to transform into the more complex, more isolated Hollywood star, a man for whom deception in relationships became a tool for getting what he wanted. Her story was largely forgotten for decades, overshadowed by the epic romance of Elvis and Priscilla. But in recent years, as more historical accounts have been published, her role has been re-examined. She represents the life Elvis could have had a marriage to a hometown girl, a more grounded existence away from the surreal bubble of Hollywood. By choosing Priscilla, a teenager he could mold, over Anita, an established woman of his own age, Elvis made a choice that would define the rest of his personal life. The betrayal of Anita Wood leaves behind some sharp and uncomfortable questions. Was his proposal to her ever sincere, or was it simply a way to ensure she would wait for him while he was gone, a placeholder for his affection? How much did Gladys's death impact his commitment to Anita, effectively breaking the strongest tie to his pre-army life? And does the story of Anita Wood prove that even at the height of his youthful charm, Elvis was already capable of a profound level of emotional dishonesty, setting the stage for the broken promises and fractured relationships that would mark his later years? Number 9, did Colonel Parker sabotage Elvis's chances at a normal marriage? The Colonel, Tom Parker, was not just Elvis Presley's manager, he was the architect of his career, a master manipulator who controlled nearly every aspect of Elvis's life, from his movie contracts to his personal appearances. But how far did that control extend into his love life? There is a compelling argument to be made that the Colonel, either through direct action or indirect influence, actively sabotaged Elvis's chances at finding a stable, normal partnership. For the Colonel, a married Elvis was a less marketable Elvis, and a strong-willed wife was a threat to his absolute authority. The Colonel's primary motivation was always money. His management contract was unprecedented, at times giving him up to 50% of Elvis's earnings. To protect this golden goose, he built a wall around Elvis, isolating him from outside influences. The wife, especially a savvy one, could be a major threat. She might question the Colonel's financial decisions, encourage Elvis to take more artistic risks, or simply demand more of his time, pulling him away from the relentless schedule of movies and concerts that made them both rich. The evidence of the Colonel's interference is most clear in the case of Anne Margaret. As documented in Alana Nash's biography of the Colonel, he was furious when the press started reporting on a potential engagement between the two stars. He saw Anne Margaret not as a potential partner for Elvis, but as a rival for publicity and influence. He allegedly pressured Elvis to publicly deny the relationship and to cool things off. The Colonel wanted Elvis to be romantically available, at least in the minds of his female fans. A serious relationship with a fellow celebrity complicated the brand. Even his marriage to Priscilla was subject to the Colonel's machinations. While he approved of Priscilla in a way he never approved of Anne Margaret, Priscilla was young, unknown, and seemingly malleable. He still controlled the narrative. The wedding itself in 1967 was not a grand family affair, but a bizarre, hastily arranged press event in Las Vegas, orchestrated by the Colonel to maximize media attention while minimizing disruption to Elvis's schedule. There were more journalists there than family members. It was a business transaction as much as it was a marriage ceremony. Throughout the 1960s, the Colonel pushed Elvis into a grueling schedule of formulaic, low-budget movies. This kept Elvis in a controlled environment in Hollywood, away from the grounding influence of a normal home life in Memphis. It also exposed him to a constant stream of beautiful co-stars, leading to numerous affairs that put a strain on his marriage to Priscilla. Was this intentional? Perhaps not directly, but it was a consequence of the Colonel's business strategy. A happy, faithful husband was not the priority a working, earning movie star was. After the divorce from Priscilla, the Colonel's influence remained. He likely viewed Linda Thompson as a manageable presence. She was not a celebrity and seemed devoted to taking care of Elvis, which meant he was more likely to be able to perform. However, had Linda pushed for marriage and a legal stake in Elvis's life, the Colonel's attitude might have changed dramatically. He had a vested interest in keeping Elvis's personal life uncomplicated, at least on paper. The girlfriends could come and go. A wife had legal rights. Some have theorized that the Colonel's own mysterious past played a role. He was an illegal immigrant from the Netherlands, born Andreas van Quich, a fact he hid his entire life. This is why Elvis never toured internationally. Despite his global fame, the Colonel couldn't get a passport and feared his past would be exposed if he ever had to apply for one. This deep-seated paranoia and need for control likely spilled over into how he managed Elvis's personal affairs. He couldn't risk any element of Elvis's life, including his choice of wife, spinning beyond his direct control. A study of personality disorders published in Psychology Today notes that individuals with extreme control needs often view the personal relationships of those they manage as potential threats to their authority. So the Colonel's role was not that of a simple manager. He was a gatekeeper, a puppet master, who saw Elvis's personal happiness as secondary to the success of the Elvis Presley enterprise. He may not have explicitly forbidden marriage, but he created an environment where a healthy, lasting one was almost impossible to sustain. This leaves us to wonder about the true extent of his influence. Did the Colonel actively break up relationships he deemed threatening, or did he just create a lifestyle so toxic that no relationship could survive it? If Elvis had a different manager, one who prioritized his well-being over his earnings, could he have had a successful marriage with someone like Anne Margaret? And ultimately, was Colonel Tom Parker the biggest obstacle to Elvis ever finding lasting love, a shadowy figure who ensured his star client would remain lonely, isolated, and most importantly, profitable? Number 8, how did the Memphis Mafia influence his choice of partners? Elvis Presley did not live alone. He was surrounded 24 hours a day by a rotating cast of friends, cousins, and employees known as the Memphis Mafia. This inner circle served as his bodyguards, his companions, his assistants, and his gatekeepers to the outside world. They were his surrogate family, and their opinion on the women in his life mattered immensely. Their influence was a powerful and often problematic force in his romantic relationships, acting as both facilitators and saboteurs. The Memphis Mafia, which included core members like Joe Esposito, Lamar Feek, Red West, and Marty Lacker, had a number of official and unofficial duties. One of the most significant was procuring female companionship for Elvis, especially when he was on the road or in Hollywood. They would screen women, invite them to parties, and facilitate introductions. This process immediately established a power dynamic where any woman entering Elvis's world had to first pass through the filter of his entourage. They were the arbiters of access. Their approval was crucial. If the guys liked a particular woman, she was more likely to get a second look from Elvis. They valued women who were cool, who didn't cause drama, and who understood the unspoken rules of their world. Elvis came first, no questions asked. A woman who was too demanding, too independent, or who tried to come between Elvis and his friends would be quickly frozen out. They had Elvis's ear, and a quiet word of disapproval from a trusted friend like Joe Esposito could be a death sentence for a budding romance. Linda Thompson was generally well-liked by the group. She fit in, she was patient, she tolerated their round-the-clock presence, and she devoted herself to taking care of Elvis. In their various books and interviews, members of the entourage often speak of her with respect and affection. They saw her as a genuinely positive influence, even if they were powerless to help her combat Elvis's drug use. Priscilla had a more complicated relationship with the group. In the early years, she was just a teenager living at Graceland, and they were tasked with chaperoning her. As she grew into her role as Elvis's wife, tensions sometimes arose. In her book Elvis and Me, she describes feeling like an outsider, a lone woman in a man's world. She tried to create a more normal home life, which sometimes clashed with the freewheeling all hours lifestyle of Elvis and his crew. The group's influence could also be deeply negative. They were enablers of his worst impulses, including his womanizing. While Elvis was with Priscilla or Linda, it was often members of the Memphis Mafia who were tasked with discreetly managing his affairs on the side. This created a culture of secrecy and deception that made true faithfulness impossible. The book, Elvis, What Happened, written by the fired bodyguards Red and Sonny West, details this lifestyle in stark terms. They were participants in the betrayal of the women Elvis claimed to love. When it came to Ginger Alden, the opinions within the group were sharply divided. Some saw her as a sweet girl who made Elvis happy in his final months. Others, however, viewed her and her family with deep suspicion. Marty Lacker, one of the most outspoken members, has been publicly critical of the Aldens for years, accusing them of being motivated by money. This division within the ranks after Elvis's death helped fuel the public controversy over whether Ginger's engagement was legitimate. If his closest friends couldn't agree, how could anyone else know the truth? The Memphis Mafia's role was a reflection of Elvis's own needs. As a 2011 study in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships on the social networks of celebrities suggests, entourages can provide a vital buffer against the pressures of fame, but they can also foster an unhealthy dependency and isolate the star from normal social interactions. Elvis needed the guys around him. They were his connection to his past and his shield against the present. But their constant presence meant that he could never have a truly private, one-on-one relationship with a woman. Every date, every conversation, every argument happened with an audience. This strange communal living situation raises some disturbing questions. Could any woman ever have had a truly authentic relationship with Elvis while living under the constant watch of his entourage? How many potential relationships were quietly ended by the Memphis Mafia before Elvis even got seriously involved? And to what extent were the guys just following orders, reflecting Elvis's own conflicted desires versus actively shaping his romantic choices to suit their own interests and maintain their coveted positions in his court? Number 7 was the ideal woman, an unattainable fantasy for Elvis. Elvis Presley had a type. Or rather, he had two types. On one hand, he was drawn to vibrant, sexy, and worldly women like his co-star Anne Margaret. On the other hand, the woman he wanted to marry, the one he wanted to install at Graceland as the mother of his children, had to fit a very different, very specific mold. This ideal woman was young, pure, and submissive. She was a blank slate upon whom he could write his own desires. This rigid and contradictory vision of the perfect partner created a psychological trap from which he could never escape. It made finding a real, lasting relationship an almost impossible task. This Madonna whore complex, a term first coined by Sigmund Freud, is often used to describe men who categorize women into two mutually exclusive groups: the Madonnas, who are pure and worthy of marriage, and the whores, who are desirable but unfit for a serious commitment. Elvis's romantic history is a textbook example of this psychological split. He craved the excitement of women who were his equals, but he was seemingly only capable of committing to women he could dominate. The ultimate example is his choice of Priscilla. He met her when she was 14. He spent years grooming her to be his perfect wife, controlling her appearance, her education, and her social life. In her book, Elvis and Me, Priscilla describes how he wanted her to remain a virgin until their wedding night. He was building his Madonna from the ground up. This need for a pure partner was a recurring theme. After Priscilla, he was often drawn to beauty queens and other young women who projected an image of innocence and wholesomeness, like Linda Thompson and Ginger Alden. This obsession with purity was deeply rooted in his upbringing. He was the beloved only son of a doting mother, Gladys, in the conservative religious culture of the American South in the 1940s and 50s. As Albert Goldman details in his controversial but meticulously researched 1981 biography, Elvis, the cultural norms of his youth, instilled a deep reverence for motherhood and female virtue, alongside a more hidden good old boy attitude towards casual sex. He was taught that good girls didn't, and the girls who did weren't good. This created a paradox. The very qualities that made a woman exciting and interesting to him, independence, confidence, worldliness, were often the same qualities that disqualified her, in his mind, as marriage material. He couldn't reconcile his desire for a passionate partner with his need for a submissive wife. Anne Margaret was the perfect example. He was electrified by her, but he ultimately retreated to the safer choice of Priscilla. His drug use in his later years only exacerbated this fantasy. The cocktail of uppers, downers, and painkillers he consumed created a world of his own making, further detaching him from reality. In this state, he could believe in the fantasy of finding another pure, perfect girl who would save him without having to confront the messy realities of a real relationship between two equals. Dr. George Nicopolis, his personal physician, noted in his book The King and Dr. Nick that Elvis lived in a bubble, where his every whim was catered to. This extended to his relationships. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a perfect companion who existed to meet his needs. This pursuit of an unattainable ideal doomed his relationships from the start. Linda Thompson came the closest to bridging the gap. She was both a devoted caregiver and a strong personality. But eventually, even she couldn't live up to the impossible standard. She wanted a life of her own, a desire that clashed with Elvis's need for a woman whose life revolved entirely around him. Her decision to leave was, in essence, a rejection of the fantasy. So, the ideal woman for Elvis was not a real person. She was a collage of contradictory traits: a virgin and a sex kitten, a mother figure, and a childlike dependent, an independent soul who was also completely obedient. No real woman could ever be all these things. This leads to some fundamental questions about his psychology. Was his lifelong search for the ideal woman really a search for the unconditional love he lost when his mother died? Did he sabotage his relationships with strong women because he was fundamentally afraid of being abandoned by them, as he had been by Priscilla? And ultimately, was the greatest love story of Elvis's life not with any woman, but with a fantasy he could never make real? As number 6, who was June Wanico, and did she almost become the first Mrs. Presley? In the summer of 1956, Elvis Presley was on the cusp of becoming the biggest star in the world. Heartbreak Hotel had topped the charts, and his television appearances were causing a national scandal. He was young, impossibly handsome, and at the peak of his powers. That summer, he returned to his roots for a brief vacation in Biloxi, Mississippi. It was there that he reconnected with June Wanico, a girl he had met briefly the year before. For a few blissful weeks, they were inseparable, and in the eyes of many, she was the first woman who truly captured his heart and came close to being his wife. June Wanico's story, which she tells in her 1997 book Elvis, in the Twilight of Memory, provides a rare glimpse of the pre-superstar Elvis, the man before the myth. Unlike his later relationships, which were conducted inside the gilded cage of Graceland, his time with June was remarkably normal. They went on dates, went to the movies, spent time with her family, and just hung out. She wasn't a fan, she was his girlfriend. She saw the playful, goofy side of him, not the icon. Their romance was deep and seemingly serious. He gave her a diamond ring, and according to her, asked her to marry him. He even talked to her parents about his intentions. For a moment, it seemed real. He was a Southern boy who had made it big, and he was ready to settle down with a hometown girl. He had not yet been fully consumed by his fame. He hadn't yet been shipped off to the army or co-opted by Hollywood. This was perhaps the last moment of authentic normalcy in his life. But the machinery of his career, managed by Colonel Tom Parker, was already in motion. The Colonel had a vision for Elvis, and a quick marriage to a girl from Biloxi was not part of it. The Colonel's strategy was to keep Elvis single and available, a fantasy for millions of female fans. A wife would complicate the image and, more importantly, the bottom line. According to Wanico, the end of their relationship was directly tied to the Colonel's influence and the demands of Elvis's burgeoning career. Elvis was being pulled into the Hollywood orbit, set to begin filming his first movie, Love Me Tender. The pressures were mounting. In her book, Wanico describes a heartbreaking phone call where Elvis told her that his management didn't want him to be seen with one particular girl. He needed to be seen with lots of different women for publicity. He asked her to understand. But for her, it was a betrayal. She couldn't be just one of many. The relationship ended. The story of June Wanico is significant because it represents a crossroads in Elvis's life. He had a choice between a relatively normal life with a woman he seemed to genuinely love and the path of superstardom that the Colonel was paving for him. He chose the latter. This decision set a precedent for all his future relationships. It was the first time, but not the last, that his career and the demands of his image would take priority over his personal happiness. Historians like Elaine Dundee have suggested that the summer of 1956 with June was the last time Elvis was truly free. After that, he became a product, a carefully managed commodity. His personal life became an extension of his public image. or his choice to leave June was his first major sacrifice on the altar of fame. Looking back, the story of June Waniko feels like a lost chapter, a tender and tragic prelude to the chaos that would follow. It begs the question of what might have been. If he had married June in 1956, would he have avoided the isolating bubble of fame that later enveloped him? Would a grounded early marriage have saved him from the destructive path he eventually took? Or was the pull of his destiny too strong? And was any woman who tried to hold him to a normal life, whether it was June Waniko in 1956 or Linda Thompson in 1976, doomed to fail? And was the ring he gave her a genuine proposal, or his first attempt at using a piece of jewelry to secure a woman's affection while he figured out his next move? Number 5, how have these women's stories evolved over the decades? The story of Elvis Presley's life is not a single static narrative. It is a collection of memories, told by different people, with different motivations at different times. This is especially true when it comes to the women who claim to be his fiancées. Their accounts, given in interviews and autobiographies spanning more than 4 decades, have not always been consistent. They have evolved, shaped by the passage of time, the influence of other tellings, and the changing nature of their own legacies. Priscilla Presley's narrative has been the most influential, and it has also seen a subtle evolution. Her 1985 book, Elvis and Me, was a bombshell. It was the first truly intimate account from someone who had lived with him. It detailed their unusual courtship, his controlling nature, his drug use, and his infidelity. It was a loving but also critical portrait. In the decades since, as the guardian of his official legacy through Elvis Presley Enterprises, her public telling of the story has softened. And her interviews now tend to focus more on the love, the unique connection, and the positive memories. The sharper, more painful details from her book are often downplayed in favor of a narrative that protects the romantic myth of the king. This isn't necessarily a contradiction, but a shift in emphasis, a curation of memory for a public audience. Linda Thompson's story has been remarkable for its consistency. From her earliest interviews in the late 1970s to her 2016 memoir, A Little Thing Called Life, the core elements of her account have remained the same: her deep love for Elvis, her attempts to save him from his drug addiction, his infidelity, and her painful decision to leave to save herself. Her narrative has been corroborated by numerous members of the Memphis Mafia and is widely considered to be one of the most reliable and honest accounts of Elvis's final years. The consistency of her story over 40 years gives it a powerful weight of credibility. She has never wavered from the fundamental truths of their time together. The story of Ginger Alden, however, has been the subject of the most scrutiny and has seen the most significant evolution. In the immediate aftermath of Elvis's death, the Alden family's story, as reported by the press, focused on the tragic discovery of his body and the upcoming Christmas wedding. But then came the lawsuit against the estate, which tarnished their image. For decades, Ginger remained largely silent, her story defined by others, many of whom were hostile to her. Her 2014 book, Elvis and Ginger, was her attempt to reclaim the narrative. In the book, she presents a much more detailed and idyllic version of their romance than had previously been public. She describes a happy, forward-looking Elvis, a man excited about their future. This portrayal stands in stark contrast to the grim picture of a sick, depressed man, painted by almost every other source from that period, including the 1981 Goldman biography and the 1999 Guralnick biography. Critics have pointed out that her book omits or downplays negative aspects, such as Elvis's violent mood swings and the extent of his drug use, which were reported by others who were present during that time. This evolution of stories is a natural human process. A 2012 study on autobiographical memory from Northwestern University found that our recollection of past events is not a perfect recording, but is actively reconstructed each time we recall it, often influenced by our current emotions and goals. For these women, telling their story is not just an act of remembrance, it is an act of defining their own lives and their place in one of the 20th century's biggest cultural stories. The changing narratives force us to be critical consumers of their histories. Why did Ginger Alden wait 37 years to tell her full story in a book? Has Priscilla's role as the official gatekeeper of the Elvis legacy influenced her to present a more sanitized version of their life together? And Does Linda Thompson's unwavering consistency make her account the most trustworthy benchmark against which all other stories from that era should be measured? The truth of what happened in the private rooms of Graceland may lie somewhere in the space between all these evolving, competing, and deeply personal stories. Number 4, did his Southern Baptist roots shape his conflicted views on women and marriage? To understand Elvis Presley's complicated relationships with women, you have to understand where he came from. He was born in Tupelo, Mississippi in 1935 and raised in the cultural crucible of the Jim Crow South, steeped in the traditions of the Assembly of God Church, a Pentecostal denomination with strong Southern Baptist influences. This upbringing, with its fiery sermons, its deep-seated social conservatism, and its complex views on sin and salvation, profoundly shaped his worldview and created a deep, lifelong conflict in his attitudes towards women, sex, and marriage. The church was the center of his early life. It's where he discovered his love for music, singing gospel hymns with his parents. But it also gave him a very specific moral framework. This framework, common in the Bible Belt, preached the sanctity of marriage, the importance of female purity, and the damnation that awaited those who strayed from the righteous path. Women were to be respected and put on a pedestal, especially mothers. Gladys Presley was the center of Elvis's universe, the embodiment of perfect unconditional love. He would spend his life searching for a woman who could fill the void she left. At the same time, he grew up in a culture with a stark double standard for men and women. While women were expected to be virtuous, it was often tacitly accepted that boys will be boys. This created a deep psychological split. He could revere women in the abstract, as mothers and future wives, while simultaneously viewing them as objects for his own gratification. This isn't just speculation, it's a pattern documented in countless biographies. He needed his serious girlfriend or wife to be a good girl, a Priscilla or a Linda, while he engaged in countless affairs with co-stars, extras, and fans on the road. This conflict is evident in his music. He could sing a tender ballad like Love Me Tender with utter sincerity, and then pivot to the raw, overtly sexual energy of Jailhouse Rock. He was both the good son singing gospel and the rebellious sinner shaking his hips. This duality wasn't an act, it was the core of his internal struggle. He was a deeply spiritual man who was also a slave to his worldly appetites. His views on marriage were also deeply traditional. He was the man of the house. He expected his wife to be at home, to raise the children, and to cater to his needs. As Priscilla detailed in her memoir, he was incredibly controlling, dictating her every move. This wasn't necessarily born of malice, but of a deeply ingrained belief reinforced by his culture that this was the natural order of things. The man provided and protected, and the woman nurtured and obeyed. This patriarchal view made a partnership of equals almost impossible for him to comprehend. Some sociologists, like those cited in the book Redeeming the South Religious Cultures and Racial Identities Among Southern Baptists, have studied how this specific religious subculture shapes gender roles. They find that it often promotes a model of male headship that can lead to difficulties in forming modern egalitarian relationships. So Elvis was a product of this environment. He was a 20th century superstar living by a 19th century code. So when we look at his string of broken promises and failed relationships, we aren't just looking at the behavior of a spoiled celebrity. We are looking at the predictable outcome of a man torn between his religious ideals and his human desires, between the reverence he was taught to have for women and the power he had to possess them. The lingering questions are deeply personal. Did Elvis ever see the hypocrisy in his own behavior, or did he genuinely believe he could separate his actions on the road from his commitments at home? How much of his later life spiritual searching was driven by a deep sense of guilt over his failure to live up to the moral code of his youth? And could he have ever found peace in a relationship, or was he doomed to forever chase an ideal of female purity that he himself was incapable of honoring? Number 3, could anyone truly be engaged to the Elvis of 1977? By 1977, Elvis Presley was a shadow of his former self. The vibrant, electrifying performer who had changed the world was gone, replaced by a bloated, medicated, and profoundly isolated man. He was in a state of catastrophic physical and mental decline, a prisoner in his own home, his life dictated by the rhythms of his prescription drug abuse. In this context, the very idea of him making a rational, long-term commitment like marriage seems almost absurd. So when we discuss Ginger Alden's claim to be his fiancée, the most fundamental question isn't whether he gave her a ring, but whether the Elvis of 1977 was even capable of being a fiancé. The evidence of his condition in his final year is overwhelming and tragic. The book Elvis, What Happened, released just before his death, was the first public expose of his secret life. His former bodyguards detailed his drug use, his bizarre and paranoid behavior, his uncontrolled temper, and his near-total isolation. They described a man who would stay awake for days on end, fueled by stimulants, then knock himself out for a day with powerful sedatives. His diet was appalling, and his health problems were numerous, including an enlarged colon, high blood pressure, and liver damage. Peter Guralnick's Careless Love provides an even more detailed, day-by-day account of this final, grim chapter. The concerts from this period, which are available on bootlegs and in documentaries like Elvis: The Final Hours, are painful to watch. He was often overweight, sweaty, and barely able to remember the lyrics to his own songs. He would ramble incoherently between numbers. This was not a man planning a future. This was a man who was visibly dying. His personal physician, Dr. George Nikopoulos, would later have his medical license suspended for overprescribing medication to Elvis and other patients. In the 2 years before his death, Dr. Nick prescribed over 12,000 pills for Elvis. This level of polypharmacy would have a devastating effect on anyone's cognitive function. A 2018 study in the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology confirms that the combination of opioids, sedatives, and stimulants Elvis was taking can lead to severe confusion, impaired judgment, memory loss, and paranoia. Was a man in this state of mind capable of giving informed consent to marriage? His emotional state was just as precarious. He was deeply lonely and desperate for companionship, but his paranoia and mood swings made stable relationships impossible. He would lash out at his friends and entourage with little provocation. He was obsessed with spiritualism and numerology, searching for answers in books while ignoring the reality of his own self-destruction. This is the man who proposed to Ginger Alden. She was a 20-year-old who had known him for only a few months. Was she in love, or was she and her family simply overwhelmed by the fame and generosity of a man who was not in his right mind? It's possible to believe that Elvis was sincere in his proposal in that specific moment. In a moment of drug-induced clarity or sentimentality, he may have genuinely felt that getting married would save him. But a fleeting emotional impulse is not the same as a rational, sustainable commitment. To be a fiancé implies a shared plan for the future, but the Elvis of 1977 had no future. His touring schedule was erratic, his health was failing, and his creative drive was gone. He was living day to day, and sometimes hour to hour. Any promise he made in that state has to be viewed through the lens of his profound illness. The final, unsettling questions are the most important. Are we holding a desperately sick man accountable for promises he was in no condition to make? Does it matter if the engagement was real, if the man at the center of it was no longer fully present? And by focusing on the legitimacy of a wedding that never happened, are we distracting ourselves from the more tragic and undeniable truth that by 1977, Elvis Presley was engaged not to a woman, but to death? Number 2, what's the difference between a promise and a proposal in Elvis's world? In the world Elvis Presley created for himself, normal rules did not apply. This was true for his finances, his friendships, and especially his romantic relationships. The words had different meanings. Gestures were amplified to a spectacular degree. In this supercharged environment, the line between a promise and a proposal became dangerously blurred. Understanding this distinction is key to deciphering the claims of the women who believed they were going to be his wife. A proposal, in the conventional sense, is a formal question with the intent to marry, usually followed by planning a wedding and building a future. It's a contract, both emotional and practical. A promise, on the other hand, can be much more fluid. It's an assurance, a statement of intent that may or may not be fulfilled. For Elvis, it seems that what the women in his life heard as a proposal, he may have intended as a promise of his love, his commitment in that moment, his generosity. The primary currency of these promises was jewelry. Elvis gave away rings like other men give compliments. A diamond ring from Elvis was a sign that you were special, that you were in his favor. For Anita Wood, it was a promise to wait. For Linda Thompson, the multiple rings were promises of his enduring affection, even in the midst of turmoil. For Ginger Alden, the massive diamond was the ultimate promise, a spectacular gesture from a man whose health and career were in shambles. He was promising her a future he was in no condition to deliver. This use of grand gestures in place of practical commitment is a behavior often seen in people with narcissistic tendencies or addiction issues. A 2017 article in Psychology Today on future faking describes how some individuals make grand promises about a shared future to secure a partner's devotion in the present, with no real intention of following through. While it may not have been a conscious, malicious strategy for Elvis, it was a pattern. The promise of a wedding was the ultimate tool to keep a woman by his side, loyal and devoted. It was his way of saying, I choose you, without having to do the hard work of building a real shared life. The context of his life made this possible. He was surrounded by an entourage that catered to his every whim. He never had to book a flight, pay a bill, or cook a meal. He lived in a state of perpetual childhood. In this bubble, commitments were abstract. He could promise a wedding with the same casualness he promised a new Cadillac. The follow-through was someone else's problem. The women, of course, interpreted these moments differently. Is raised in a more conventional world, a man getting down on one knee with a diamond ring meant one thing: marriage. They heard a proposal. They saw a future. But they may have been misinterpreting the language of Elvis's world. In his language, a ring wasn't the start of a plan, it was the peak of a feeling. It was a spectacular present-tense expression of love, not a blueprint for a life together. This semantic confusion explains a lot. It explains how he could be engaged to Anita while courting Priscilla. It explains how he could propose to Linda multiple times without ever setting a date. And it explains how he could propose to Ginger just months before his death, when he was clearly in no shape to be anyone's husband. He wasn't proposing marriage in the way a normal person does. He was making the ultimate promise of affection, a promise symbolized by a ring, because it was the grandest gesture he knew how to make. So, the critical questions remain: did these women understand the difference between a promise and a proposal in Elvis's world, or were they victims of a fundamental misunderstanding? Was Elvis himself even aware of the distinction, or was he so lost in his own fantasy world that he believed his grand promises were the same as real-world commitments? And ultimately, does it matter what he intended, or does the only thing that matters is how his promises were received by the women who staked their hearts on them? Number one, are we asking the wrong question about fiancés? For decades, the debate has raged among fans and biographers. Was Ginger Alden really his fiancée? Did he truly intend to marry Linda Thompson? Was Anita Wood the one he let get away? We obsess over the details of the rings, the dates, he said, she said accounts, trying to validate or debunk each claim. We sift through the evidence as if we are lawyers in a case trying to arrive at a definitive verdict. But after all these years, perhaps it's time to consider that we are asking the wrong question entirely. Maybe the question isn't, who was Elvis Presley's true fiancé? Maybe the real question is, why did Elvis Presley need to have a fiancé at all times? Looking at his life after his divorce from Priscilla in 1973, a clear and desperate pattern emerges. He was never truly alone. The moment Priscilla left, Linda Thompson moved in. The moment Linda left, Ginger Alden arrived. There were no gaps. He required the constant presence of a live and female companion. This wasn't just about dating, it was about filling a profound void at the center of his life. The role of fiancé, or future wife, was the job title he gave to the woman who filled that void. This need went beyond simple loneliness. It was a structural requirement for his life. He needed a woman at Graceland to create the illusion of a home, a sanctuary from the madness of his fame. She was the anchor, the steady presence who was there when he woke up, and there when he went to sleep. She was the caregiver, the nurse, the mother figure. As his health declined, this role became even more critical. Linda Thompson spent years nursing him through drug overdoses and health scares. Ginger Alden was there in his final, desperate months. The engagement was the tool he used to secure this arrangement. It elevated the relationship beyond that of a mere girlfriend. It implied a seriousness, a permanence, that kept the woman invested and willing to endure the immense difficulties of his lifestyle, the drugs, the infidelity, the isolation. A proposal was a powerful way to say, you are not temporary, this is real, please don't leave me. It was a cry for help disguised as a romantic gesture. This perspective reframes the entire debate. It stops being a competition between the women and becomes a tragic portrait of the man. It suggests that Elvis's proposals were less about the women themselves and more about his own desperate need for stability. Any woman who fit his specific criteria of youth, beauty, and devotion could have potentially filled the role. He wasn't choosing a life partner, he was casting a part in the ongoing drama of his own life. This idea is supported by the work of psychologists who study celebrity culture. And Dr. Donna Rockwell, a clinical psychologist who specializes in fame, has written about the disintegration of the self that can occur with extreme celebrity. Famous individuals can lose their sense of authentic identity, becoming trapped by their public persona. For Elvis, having a fiancée at home might have been a way to feel normal, to perform the role of a man in a committed relationship even if he was incapable of the real thing. So, instead of asking if Ginger Alden's ring was a real engagement ring, we should ask why Elvis felt the need to give an 11.5-carat diamond to a woman he barely knew. Instead of asking why Linda Thompson left, we should ask what it says about Elvis that the most devoted woman in his life had to flee to save herself. Instead of trying to rank the women, we should look at what the pattern of his behavior tells us about his own internal state, his profound loneliness, his fear of abandonment, and his inability to connect on a truly equal, authentic level. The final, lingering questions are not for them, but for him. What was he so afraid of in the silence of an empty room? Was the constant presence of a fiancé the last defense against the crushing weight of being Elvis Presley? And in the end, does the long list of women who carried his rings and his promises tell us less about who he loved and more about the fact that he may not have been capable of truly loving anyone at all?